some news here in Georgia and Atlanta. We want to thank Rotary for your time and attention to the state of local news. I'm going to kick it off for about 5 minutes with just some foundational facts, and then we'll get into a panel and hear from folks doing the work in our area. So I won't bury the lead today. We are in Georgia and across the country. Local news is imperative, it's facing some peril, and it's pivoting and adapting so it can sustain and continue to serve. And you don't have to take my word for it. We have lots of good facts that will support us. So you've heard already that there's a crisis of trust in the media, right, across the country. And one of the best links and possibilities in rebuilding trust is local reporters. The American public is more likely to trust their local reporter than the national media. There's a few facts up here so you can see attitudes like covering issues I can use in my daily life, reporting without bias, being accurate, being trustworthy. So local reporters are, I think, a big part of this rebuilding trust. Next up, possibly most importantly, there are strong links, according to the Knight Foundation, Pew Center for Research, etc., that local news consumption is highly correlated with caring about community, feeling attached, and then much more likely to participate regularly in elections. So this is when we say local news supports the health of our democracy, what we're talking about is people caring, people voting, and people having accurate facts on which to base their opinions and decisions. And even bankers and economists recognize the link between local news and healthy communities. So when they go to set the municipal bond rates, they actually factor in how strong is the coverage and the local reporting in this community, because that is going to strengthen the effectiveness, shall we say, of the local elected officials, as well as the financial health of that community. So if you're not in it for your heart and your vote, be in it for your wallet. Local news helps create your community healthier. So at the same time, while local news is highly valued, it's facing some tough times. Everybody in here, I'm glad some people were listening on the radio, that's good. But also we can get the news from our phones, our computers, our laptops, our smart speakers. And so that has had this big impact on the economics. And nobody has been hit harder than legacy newspapers. And you probably saw in the promotion for this very event, 25% of our newspapers have disappeared in the last 20 years. Well, that's going to be 30% by 2025. However, I guess fortunately for all of us, local news can be defined by other forms of media. The part that's alarming is 50% of employment in newsrooms has disappeared. That's 50% less reporters out there holding people accountable, covering stories, giving voice to our community. And as you'll hear from our panel, there are young people who want to get into journalism. We just need to create the economics to sustain their employment. So you might have heard the term, do you live in a news, or have you heard the term news desert? So there are 200 counties in the US that are documented to not have a newspaper. And 17 of those counties, give or take depending on the day or the month, are in Georgia. And we know that Atlanta has a fairly healthy ecosystem for news, but it's our neighbors out in smaller communities, more rural communities that are suffering, and they're vulnerable to the malignant spread of misinformation and disinformation. So we as a whole state want to address this issue. We are ready to pivot and to adapt and to keep local news rolling. We're not giving up without a fight. And today's panel will get into that. Today's reporters are still the frontline workers for our democracy. They're just reaching the public in a different way. They're reaching through websites, e-newsletters, podcasts, blogs, tweets, for goodness sake. So that's an ecosystem we want to keep healthy. And across the country, we've seen entrepreneurship as well as philanthropy helping with this transition for news. And y'all probably have heard of things like the National Trust for Local News, the Institute for Nonprofit News. Well, here in Georgia, we're starting a new initiative called the Georgia News Collaborative. And the idea is to bring the benefits of a collective model to help with some of the shared battles and initiatives that local news face. So we are so fortunate here that in Atlanta we have a leader, an esteemed, wonderful leader who has volunteered her time in her retirement for the last year to help be a catalyst to make this start. So y'all, probably everyone here knows Penny McPhee, former member of the Atlanta Rotary, and President Emeritus of the Blank Foundation, as well as, you probably didn't know, a former journalist and a former leader at the Knight Foundation. So we are very fortunate, and we thank Penny for her initiative and her service to kick this off, get it started, and tell us more today.
It is wonderful to be here among so many friends today. I've missed you all, and I'm glad to see you all well. And a big thank you to President Stephanie and to David Lewis for inviting us to share an important homegrown Georgia innovation that lines up with all three of Rotary's themes for this year: finding common ground for common good, confronting disinformation, and Atlanta in the next 50 years. So before I introduce the Georgia News Collaborative and our panelists, I want to thank a number of Rotarians who have been instrumental in its birth. Of course, Jennifer Dorian, who along with Kevin Riley, Bill Bowling, Taya Ryan, and Maria Saporta have been with us from the beginning. Special thanks to Ann Curry. Cox Curry's incredible team has provided us with literally unlimited pro bono hours to move this project forward. And thanks as well to Frank Fernandez. The Community Foundation of Greater Atlanta has agreed to be our fiscal agent and do our the back office work for us while we get started. So I urge you to send your contributions to Frank right away. Might have made a Rotary movie. I hope I haven't left out any Rotarians. We've been so fortunate to have the engagement of so many Atlanta and Georgia leaders, so thank you all. So what is the Georgia News Collaborative and how did it all begin? In the spring of 2021, just as I was saying my farewells to Blank Foundation, a number of friends and colleagues began asking me, what is your next chapter going to be? And I'm like, honestly, I'm looking forward to a life of leisure, to traveling, to being with my family. I'm not ready to commit to anything. But I recognized in several of those conversations, fragmented groups were working on an issue that I am passionate about: strengthening a core principle of our democracy, a free, trustworthy, and sustainable press. So it did seem that with my background in journalism and philanthropy, I could help bring these diverse efforts together so that the whole would add up to more than the sum of the parts. The Georgia News Collaborative is now just over 1 year old, and though we've accomplished a lot, we're still in our infancy. The collaborative includes members spanning the spectrum from large legacy news organizations to micro-digital newsrooms reaching underserved audiences. And there are more who probably didn't make it onto this slide. The members represent newspapers, broadcast media, and digital newsrooms across Georgia. And we're still growing. We're eager to expand and to continue to connect with newsrooms and journalists around the state. Statewide is important, and you heard that from Jennifer because of where so many news deserts are. All of these entities, whether for-profit or non-profit, are affected by the multifaceted challenges that Jennifer talked about. So our panel today will talk about how a coalition of engaged, passionate individuals and organizations have come together to seek solutions and what you can do to help. We don't claim to have all the answers. We do know there is no single solution. We've looked at models in other places, and we hope to create approaches that are uniquely Georgia. Georgia has a real opportunity to lead across the nation with a statewide collaborative that enhances but doesn't duplicate existing efforts. We're not about creating new newsrooms, which has been an approach in other states. You may have seen, for example, the Texas Tribune. We're about doubling down to make sure our existing newsrooms across the state are well-resourced and able to provide all Georgians with the news and information they need to be effective citizens. Though we are still in our infancy, we've had a few early successes. You may have seen in yesterday's AJC a large Google ad promoting its work for advancing local journalism. We received an early research grant from Google to do a landscape analysis of news consumption in Georgia. You'll hear more about that from our guest, Tracy Powell. Many of our members are already collaborating on stories in an effort to reach more audiences, more diverse audiences, with trustworthy, authentic reporting in their own voices. But in addition to research and co-reporting, collaborative members are focusing on building trust by confronting misinformation and disinformation, providing quality local news in news deserts, creating a robust pipeline of Georgia journalists, and building newsroom capacity and sustainability. So now it's time to hear from our real stars who are engaging in these issues firsthand every day. Hopefully you've already seen their full bios on the website, so I'm going to only give a few headlines. You guys can start coming up while I'm doing that. Tracy Powell is a leader in philanthropic efforts to increase racial equity and diversity in news media. She's truly a journalistic entrepreneur. She's the founder of the Pivot Fund, which seeks to support independent community news by and for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color and marginalized communities. She's a fall 2021 Shorenstein Center Research Fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School, where she's researching funding and capacity building for BIPOC media organizations. Before starting the Pivot Fund, Tracy worked for several major foundations and was a 2016 Knight Fellow at Stanford. She's a graduate of our own Grady College of Journalism at UGA and the Georgetown University Law Center. Tracy, thanks for being here. Scott Morrissey is a Rotarian in Albany, Georgia, where he serves as president and publisher of the Albany Herald and VP of Digital for Southern Community Newspapers, Inc. Over the last 25 years, Scott has managed 3 newspaper companies in 4 states. In Georgia, he served as president and publisher of the Athens Banner Herald. Scott is also very active in the Georgia Press Association, another partner in our collaborative. Scott, thank you for coming from Albany to be with us today. I know we weren't the only draw, perhaps only an excuse to see your son. Most of you know Bill Nigut, Senior Executive Producer at Georgia Public Broadcasting, where he has been the host and executive producer of Political Rewind since 2013. He spent 20 years as the national and state political correspondent for WSB and TV in Atlanta, covering 5 presidential campaigns, the White House, and Capitol Hill. He and his playwright wife, Janice Schaefer, are dear, dear friends. Thank you, Bill, for being here. Each of you represent very different types of organizations. So I'd like to begin with the same question to each of you.
Begin to the mic.
Thank you. Is this better?
Yes.
Okay. Same question to each of you. I'll start, Scott, with you. Why specifically is the Georgia News Collaborative important to you as a journalist, your organization, or to the media landscape in Georgia? What do you expect to give to it and gain from it?
I think in today's world, can you hear me? I think in today's world, that's a little easier. 5 years ago or 10 years ago, if you talk to journalists, they would not want to collaborate. They would not want to be in the same room. They don't want to do the same things. And as we all know, that time has passed. And so how I've been excited by this collaborative is you all have sat on boards and been a part of efforts, and sometimes they just are more about being together than it is the outcomes. And truly, I think, Penny, importantly for me, is there's real traction at a speed that you don't normally see in organizations like this. And the outcomes are, we will collaborate. We are starting to build those lines and alliance. And really the outcome for me is, it's not about whether your company or my company wins, it's about the readers and the people who vote every day. They'll be more informed. They'll have more in their toolbox to go and vote and take actions in their community. I think without the collaboration, we've become so small, our industry has, that if we don't do it, then there's not just the handful of gaps, the 17 or 20 gaps that we talked about, then there's half of the state that doesn't have reliable information, or whatever it might be. So, that for me is for the voters, for the people, for the readers, viewers, that's the outcome we have to carry the water bill for.
Thanks, Scott. Tracy?
Yes, thank you firstly for having me here. I think it's not only important that we as journalists collaborate with each other, we must also collaborate with the communities we serve, because the communities are key for our own sustainability and success. I think that the reason I'm here, I believe, is to maybe be a reminder, a nagger, a little bit that communities are the core of what we do. That we have to start with them and make sure that we're producing news and information that is not only relevant, but reflective of them and their concerns. That's part of the reason we're in this predicament right now, is because there seems to be a perception that journalists are disconnected from the communities that they live in and work in. And so, hopefully this collaborative is an attempt to mend that gap, to correct that perception, I think. And it's a recognition, as Scott said, that we're in this together. We have to collaborate. We have to work with each other to make sure that this democracy is stronger, to make sure our communities are more informed, and quite frankly, to make sure that we survive current perilous times.
So Georgia Public Broadcasting is in a somewhat unique position because we're a statewide organization. We, on the radio side, we have 19 stations around the state. We have 9 PBS TV stations we deal with. And since, under the leadership, frankly, of Taya Ryan, we have really expanded our digital presence in a very important way, I think. We've added staff, fortunately, but no news organization has the financial resources these days to staff up to the extent that we would all like to. This collaborative essentially allows us to multiply the number of journalists who are out there who we can turn to in a collaborative way, in a synergistic way, to say, tell us what you're doing at the current Margaret Coker. Why don't we have some of your stories published on the GPB digital sites? Why don't you, in fact, take some of our reporting? Why don't we do that with Georgia Recorder? Why don't we do that with Capital B? Why don't we do that with the Atlanta Voice and any number of the organizations that are now part of the collaborative? So we've expanded our presence dramatically by working, as Scott said, in a way that we wouldn't have dreamed of wanting to do. WAPE has a presence on my show, Political Rewind. Now, that would not have happened a number of years ago, but it's been a wonderful collaboration. And finally, I'll say, for me personally, there are representatives now from almost all of those organizations on this board who become analysts for what I do every day with Political Rewind. So we've all worked together, and I think made news gathering and reporting much more effective and cost effective as well.
Thank you. Appreciative, Bill. Okay, so one of Rotary's themes this year is confronting disinformation. We know that public trust in journalists is at an all-time low. We also know that a lot of the national rhetoric ignores real data and is intentionally divisive. how do you all see the collaborative making a difference in building trust and combating disinformation? Start, Tracy.
So as we all know, no offense, Scott, journalists are trusted, thank you. I don't know offense, but journalists' reputations, I mean, people trust lawyers more than they trust us now. And that's pretty bad. A lot of it is because we have a bad rap for a lot of different reasons, but part of it is because there's so much information coming from so many different places now. People really don't know who they can trust. And so, Big J journalism, corporate media, there are a lot of different organizations out there. A lot of it people turn to when they talk about their lack of trust in news has to do, quite frankly, with cable news. Hyper-partisan, polarizing cable news channels. That's not to say that newspapers are exempt from any of this, but more and more we're seeing that, a lot of disinformation is coming from not just TV, a lot of news organizations are being bought up these days, purchased by hyper-partisan actors and using the newspapers to promote propaganda. So that too is part of this disinformation pool that we're seeing. So the collaborative is composed of a lot of local news organizations that are closest to the communities, who are trusted by the communities. And research shows us that we trust people who we know. And so because this collaborative is comprised of those people who are embedded in the communities, they are going to be more trusted. And so that's how we're fighting this unfortunate disinformation trend that we see.
Scott or Bill, do you want to add to that?
I will say that I think an important fact. I brought one little factoid that Penny's not going to toss my way. That there are more people today consuming information, community information, news, big J journalism, small J journalism, all over the country. And we have, as Jennifer's stat was, 50% of the news staff we had before, and that's rapidly declining. As importantly, I think, the collaborative, what institutional knowledge is left. We lost, in normal business, you have to cut back where you have to cut back. Well, we have 2 newspapers here in the state that lost 2 20 to 30-year veterans this week, or last week. And if you just think about the institutional knowledge, the institutional relationships that were held there, that's not a good thing for the state. It's not a good thing for telling our stories every day. So the collaboration brings all the institutional knowledge that is there together to help inform. And I think importantly, Tracy is closer to that disconnection from our community than anyone. Tracy and I talk often about how our organization might not be as connected as possible. Well, she and I have been friends. We lived in a past life as friends, and recently have opened those doors where I wouldn't have known about some of those disconnections she's very close to, potentially without this collaboration, just in the 1 year. So just about that, we're trying to be smarter and more connected to all parts of our community.
Real quickly, I think that some of the collaborative partners are our eyes and ears in the community. I may not know about a county commissioner in a race in some part of Georgia is spreading lies, disinformation about an opponent. It's part of a conspiracy, whatever, and I may not know that, except that I have collaborative partners who are keeping track of those people in their communities, and they let me know. And I can then take that, I can say to the person, say Susan Catron, the managing editor of The Current, hey, the next time you're on the show, let's talk about this disinformation campaign that's going on with that county commissioner whose work you've been following, whose lies you've been following. Now, let's be honest, what you do as consumers of news with fact-checking of disinformation is up to you. I mean, there's no way that any of us have any control over whether you choose, because of your political leanings, to believe or not believe disinformation being spread by any party. But our network of eyes and ears that allows us to see what's happening out there and comment on it.
Thanks. A lot of the work that's been missing, and you all know this because you're leaders in Atlanta, is around accountability around public officials, for example, because there just hasn't been the feet on the ground in the state houses, in the county commission meetings, in those places where things happen, to keep an eye on what really you need to know as citizens.
Can we quantify it a little bit?
Please.
And I'm going to call you out again. I was shocked.
We've been friends for a while.
Yeah. I was shocked when Scott told me that at his newspaper in Albany, Georgia, the epicenter of the coronavirus, he only has 2 full-time staff reporters to cover all of Albany and its surrounding counties. Let me repeat that. 2 reporters for that entire region. You cannot cover that region with just two journalists. That's a problem. I don't know how many, I know when we were back in the day, I'm not gonna date myself, but back in the day, we had an entire floor dedicated to reporters. Now, they don't even fill a corner of a floor.
But it does come down to what is most important and where we have to look. There's choices that are made, obviously. There's many things that may be as important to the community, but not as on fire as this piece or that piece, or you know, there's some local legislation that's going on that needs a pretty hard look. And you know, folks need to decide for themselves. Well, they need the information to decide for themselves. And as Tracy said, you know, going from a day before I was in Albany, they had 20 to 25 reporters in that newsroom, to 2 now, you're not covering, you know, as deeply as we want to or need to. In fact, in SCNI, we have 7 newspapers, and our digital footprint is bigger than ever, as I said before, but our physical footprint of news gatherers, news reporters, is 8 total people, and 2 of those are brand new. We're very fortunate to be able to add back to. And so it's a victory, but again, 8 against 6 communities is pretty sparse. So this allows,
So Bill, I'm going to turn to you to twist this a little bit. Another Rotary theme this year is finding common good, common ground for common good. And many citizens know that many citizens, even if they are not living in news deserts or perceived news deserts, still are not getting news that they feel is relevant to them. How can this collaborative address whose story is being told and how?
Well, let me give you 2 examples. There's a reporter at Capital B named Kenya Hunter. I don't know how many of you read
You
Capital
ought to explain Capital B.
Capital B is a digital news publication which focuses on the news of the Black community. It's relatively new. They have a staff that covers national news. They also have Capital B Atlanta, which focuses specifically on Georgia and Metro Atlanta. Kenya Hunter is a health reporter for them. It's Kenya Hunter who has done the most significant reporting on monkeypox and its predominance in the Black community, doing a story not long ago on the fact that Black men are getting monkeypox at far greater rates than other populations. Her stories have covered this in more detail than anyone else. She's so good, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution picked up one of her pieces within the last couple of weeks. Okay, that's powerful. That we then, because of Kenya Hunter, we can talk about that. We can post it on as a partner on our digital platforms and let people know about it. So that's a great example of how the collaborative helps us with information we might not otherwise have known. Another really wonderful example, and I'll make this quick, is I've mentioned the Current a couple times because I think they're a terrific example of a digital publication down on the Georgia coast. If you haven't read them, it's thecurrentga.org. And that .org is really important. They're a nonprofit. Nobody has covered the Camden County spaceport story the way the Current has. And here's why that's important. You may be aware of the fact that the residents of Camden County really, for the most part, across partisan lines, don't want the spaceport. The Current has reported on this with such extensive detail that it's helped the community come together. People who otherwise may vote for totally different candidates for office have come together using information they've gotten from reporting from the Current to figure out how they can fight against the county commission, which despite the fact there was a referendum in which citizens said we don't want the spaceport, the county commission is going forward with. So the Current's united people. And I think that's extraordinary. And once again, because they're a partner of GPB's, we can publish their material on our digital platform. So I think those are great examples of the positive, not, the disinformation side is important too.
Tracy, you've been doing a lot of work around the state, really identifying oases in news deserts, and some of those are very specific voices. Talk a little bit about what you've learned.
So we recently invested $2 million in 7 news outlets around the state, particularly along what they call the state's Black Belt, the southern border. And we identified organizations that produce news and information in the ways that people access it. So, again, not knocking newspapers, but newspapers are not accessed by a lot of people these days. And I will go as far as to say that people don't even use websites the way they used to anymore. They don't type in web addresses, www. whatever, when they're looking for news and information. They usually find news and information on their social media channels, or they're listening to it on radio or podcast. Facebook Live is very, very powerful. So we identify organizations that produce news and information in the ways that people access it. We also, in the language that people access information, because not everybody in our state speaks English. So why is that important? That's important because you want people to be informed. You want people to know what's going on around them. You want people to be more civically engaged. You want them to participate. And so, this collaborative, I think, wants to reflect that. We're not trying to save the newspaper industry. Yes, I know that's on a lot of people's minds. Why should philanthropy or anybody else go rush in and save big newspapers or corporate media? This is not about that. This is about saving local news, which is what people trust and believe in. This is about saving our democracy. So that's really what's driving us right now, I think. And that void that we were talking about, the disinformation that's filling that void, these are the people, these grassroots organizations are countering all of that. And they're doing it on the wing and a prayer. Pivot Fund is just now releasing those dollars in the state. It's not a huge, but for these, the 1 and 2 people organizations, right? So the money that we provided actually can be game changing for them. And then, as Bill said, the collaborative looks to them to provide that critical news and raise all of those, right? So that's why this is so important.
$2 million, you are crazy.
Scott, I'm going to switch gears a little bit here because for me, obviously, this is a passion and philosophical passion that has to do really with sustaining our democracy and one of the pillars of it. But a weak local news system also has real economic and government consequences, as Jennifer pointed out. Talk a little bit about what some of those impacts are.
Well, I think first and foremost is, in the darkness, where's Jamie? What's the in the darkness, bad stuff happens. I can't remember. But she said it. But truthfully, it's the truth. And, where there's not folks paying attention and asking questions, And Albany is no different than any other community. We've had change of the guard at local leadership, and there's strong worries in some of the recent changes we've had. Judge, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And it is that, for that reason, two reporters are going to stare at that, and they're going to ask good questions. And does it prevent bad things from happening? Probably. Can you draw a direct line from it? Maybe not. But I guarantee you look at this, and I think Jennifer's studies, if she pulled some of the Pew research, if you find those void areas of strong coverage with credible journalism or credible reporting, bad things are happening. And the changes in the community aren't good. And so I think the direct impact of these are the more eyeballs on important issues in our communities, credible reporting, the better off we all are. And it's stronger for our democracy. Because I believe, if we had no local credible reporting, it doesn't matter whether it's TV, newspapers, or radio, or any of the medias, digital, predominantly, we would be in the worst shape.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Tracy one more question, and then we're going to open it up to you folks. Tracy, one of our aspirations of the Georgia News Collaborative is being statewide, and you're going to be doing a large part of the research that Google News Initiative has funded us to do. Just briefly tell the team what that's about.
So we are doing a statewide landscape analysis. We want to look at how people consume information and where they get it from and what they do with it once they get it, right? We want to look at the news deserts and hopefully find some of those oases we've already identified in those news deserts. We want to understand how many journalists, credible, qualified, fact-based journalists in their reporting exists in the state, where the holes are, the gaps are. We will hopefully want to kind of try to fill that. And then, use that information to further build out the collaborative. I know I'm probably missing something, Penny, but if I am.
I think that's right. We want to be fact-based. We want what we do going forward to be based on what we learn from this and other data. So thank you. Okay.
So we're going to open it up to questions, but I wanted to ask one right out the gate. So we've talked a lot about misinformation, disinformation, fact-based checking. A lot of people still feel like they can't necessarily trust it. So what do you as news organizations do to show transparency? How do you put that on your website? How do you show folks how you get your information and fact check that? Is there a collaborative? Is there anything that rebuts when there is misinformation and disinformation out there? How do we keep the system itself honest so that we can in fact trust it?
I would say there's been that system in place for, since the beginning of time. If we back in the newspaper, when it's just newspaper, there's a place where you can respond in writing, and if you didn't agree or thought we were wrong, and we'd correct that. Digitally, there's far more rapid response and engagement than there ever has been. And I think it really fundamentally comes back down to what Tracy has said, credible, skilled, fact-based reporting. And in that reporting, it's sourced. And those sources are clearly stated and presented with the work. It's multi-sources, so it's not one person saying this or another. So I think the fundamentals are the same. And I think it is on the reader, viewer, watcher that they have to be open when they're listening and seeing information. Misinformation is how you receive it. And most misinformation is pretty clearly and easily dissuaded if you're really paying attention to what's going on. It's incumbent on us to more often say, here's exactly where this came from. And this is without perspective.
Either of you want to add anything?
Well, I don't run a newsroom. I just find them now. But I think that Scott is exactly right. We have a certain set of standards that govern the way we do our work. It's called the Code of Ethics, the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics. And it requires us to be transparent about who we talk to and what they said. And trust me, when we get something wrong, we know immediately. Social media is gonna tell you, nobody else, but they don't tell you when you get something wrong. And we have to correct the record. I think that when we don't attribute to the source, we provide a reason as to why. And I'm talking to a room full of people who listens to WAPE and Georgia Public Broadcasting, but the grocer in the Asian grocery store does not listen to public media chances are. The Spanish-speaking immigrant does not get his or her news information from the newspaper because it's in English and that's not a language that they read or write. And so it's really, really important, I think, that we speak directly to those folks, especially as our state becomes increasingly more diverse. And so we have to explain to them too about how we get information and why we're telling you the thing that we're telling you and how we can process information. Stuff that journalists have done forever and a day, but maybe we haven't communicated as well to the public about how we do it and how we get the information that we get.
I know Jim has a question in the back.
Thank you. A couple of quick questions. I was a journalism major, newspaper journalism major, University of Georgia. I wonder if that major even exists anymore. That's part of my question. But it's also a deeper question about that, those underlying things within the industry. One of the things we didn't talk about, you only got 2 reporters because that's all the advertising base can support. I mean, that whole economy of the newspaper business is going to change in terms of what's driving revenue. It's not the reporters, sadly. It's not having great reporters is what drives the business. It's the advertising revenue. Now my question is, what is going on in the academic institutions? I don't see the University of Georgia's logo up there. I hope they're participating in some way with what you're doing. But what is their role going forward in helping paint the future or accommodating the present?
I'll start with Dean Davis, at Grady College, is as out on front as anyone in this side of the world. I think the foundation of the journalism side of what they're teaching hasn't changed a great deal. You still have to multi-source, you still have to understand to present this information. I think what's changed in that space is they're not teaching newspaper journalism, teaching multi-channel journalism, and importantly, as you all know, you consume social media, you have to receive that information in the voice of that channel. It's not newspaper has one form of communication, and social media has different voices, if you will. I hit the one. I think you're dead right on the funding, the foundation of where the dollars come from, but I think it's more complex than just advertising. It's circulation advertising, and those 2 pieces took a hit at the same time, along with preprints and newspapers and that funding source. So it was like a trifecta of funding problems all at once.
So could I want to do a quick survey. How many of you are subscribers to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution since you're right here in Metro Atlanta? How many of you read the paper because you get that Dead Tree edition, the regular paper? Okay, how many are digital subscribers? Okay, you're part of the revolution. That's what's going to be happening, is that it isn't cost effective anymore to publish a daily newspaper on newspaper. The advertising realities are such that more and more we're moving to digital. The AJC, I think, would like to become an all-digital newspaper relatively soon. And that'll make their production costs completely marginal compared to what they're paying right now. Advertising in digital formats has picked up and is more expensive than it ever was in the past. So those of you who raised your hands and said you're digital subscribers, I think are part of the revolution that is going to change the business. Now, I don't know what's happening in Albany with that.
Let me add just 2 things, and then we'll see if there are other questions. No, thank you. That's all good. We didn't get to talk about one of the buckets of work of the collaborative does have to do with developing a pipeline of Georgia journalists. So that is part of our mission. And the The revenue side, you're exactly right. I mean, the business model is completely changed, and nobody really has figured out a new business model. So another one of our goals is to at least continue to experiment and innovate and work together to see if there are different business models. But one of the things that we know is that going forward, there is a much more likely to be a hybrid of philanthropic and call it revenue-driven business models. So, but it is part of our mission to look at all of that.
Can I ask Nancy real quickly? I sit on the board of directors for the Red and Black. The very first newspaper I worked for. Those students are incredible. Are they learning newspapers? Yeah, kind of. But they're learning news. They're also learning how to monetize news. So when it comes to audience, they're learning about audience. They're learning about how to grow audience. They're learning about advertising, generating advertising revenue. They're learning about membership programs. They're learning about subscription programs. They're learning about events revenue. So there's a whole, and when we talk about being on the front lines of what's going on, the Red and Black just recently formed its own foundation. So it is now raising dollars, actively raising dollars from philanthropy as well. So it can go alongside the business revenue that they already produce. They are also on the front lines of this experimentation that you now see happening in journalism. The University of Georgia created a nonprofit arm to purchase the Oglethorpe News, which is a nearby county. And it's staffed by University of Georgia J students and led by University of Georgia journalism faculty. They are running a community newspaper. And so, I wanted to just make sure I got that, and that's not part of the collaborative, but I hope they do become part of it.
The pipeline issue is part of the collaborative.
Yeah, that is.
Thank you.
Yes.
And we have a question from Ken.
First, I'd like to thank Tracy for elevating the reputation of lawyers.
I do have a law degree now, remember?
But what I want to say is I used to see endorsement papers about political candidates, and I've seen that go down. Do y'all think that should happen again? And what about the lack of focus on down ballot races? Everybody here hears about the governor's race. They don't hear about the labor commission, the fire chief, or the public service commission.
Well, if you listen to Political Rewind, you will. By the way, Monday through Friday, 9 a.m., repeated at 2 p.m.
So for every Rotarian that's in the room who's passionate about news and learning and figuring out what's happening in our communities and at the state level, what can we do to help besides? It's a good thing you're not in Rotary. You might have had to boot you out. But what can we do to support your efforts, and how do we get involved with this as well? Can we be like junior reporters for you with news stories? How do Rotarians get engaged?
So
And I didn't even know this was going on.
Before I answer completely your question, I actually do want Tracy to talk a little bit about the last part of your question, about community journalism and what that looks like and what that means and who's doing that in Georgia.
The organizations that the Pivot Fund invests in are usually 1 or 2 people organizations. Some are professional journalists, some are not. They are in the business of providing critical information to their communities. Community journalism may look different than what you're used to. It may sound different, but it's meeting people where they are. And so that's why we invest in what we're investing in and why we want to include them in this collaborative. It could be a podcast, it could be a mother and daughter, broadcasting on Facebook, using Facebook Live. It could be, Spanish language podcast that syndicates its content to other Spanish language radio stations. For the Pivot Fund, we are supporting collaborations already, many collaborations, I would say. The largest Black-owned radio network in the state, Davis Broadcasting, we support them. They used to have a news department, they no longer do. We're supporting collaboration with the Courier Echo Latino. It was a print product before the pandemic, now it's only digital. And so we know that people get their news and information from radio. So that's why we're supporting radio with that print, that former print product in Columbus, Georgia. So it looks and sounds maybe a little, that's probably why it's not on they're not on as many people's radar, because it does look and sound a little bit different than what we're used to.
And folks within these communities, to your point, are acting as reporters.
Right.
So the more, the better. So first of all, let me thank you all for having us here today. I hope we've given you some insights into not just the collaborative, but the importance of local news to your lives and to our communities. There are ways that you can help, and one of them we already talked about, which is be your own fact checker. Be sure that the news you're getting is real, not fake news. That's number one. You have to really be a consumer, a good consumer of news. But you also can support us with ad dollars. So your ad dollars, your sponsorship dollars can go toward trusted local media you believe in. Obviously, philanthropic donations, that's a big part. And truly, with your help and with, I think, the work of many, many people who are not just in Georgia, but around the country working on this issue, we can turn around journalism. We can find new business models. You're business people. You may have ideas about new business innovations that would be valuable to our collaborative. So just think of this as something that is really going to be important to Atlanta and to Georgia for the next 50 years.
Well, thank you. As a reminder, no Rotary next week. We will see you on September 12th at Rotary on the Road. Please join me in thanking